Hey everyone, so in this lesson we're going to go over solving quadratic equations by using the quadratic formula. Okay, so right now we know how to solve quadratic equations by factoring. So let's review a factoring problem. Okay, so let's say I have problem x squared plus 8x equals negative 15. Okay, so we know to solve by factoring, first thing we're going to do is set our equation equal to 0. So I'm going to add 15 to both sides. Then on the left-hand side, we want to factor completely. So first thing we look for is the greatest common factor, or the GCF. Okay, so there is no greatest common factor for these three terms. So since we have a trinomial, we're going to try factoring this using try to by. We're going to go from a trinomial to two binomials. Okay, so here we're looking for numbers that multiply to 15 and add to 8. So the numbers that multiply to 15 and add to 8 are going to be 3 and 5. So I'm going to set up my parentheses as x with a 3 and x with a 5. Okay, so in this case, the signs in the parentheses are both the same, and they're both going to be positive. So once I factor completely, now I'm going to set each factor equal to 0, or make a t-chart. And then we solve those resulting equations. So we get our two solutions are x equals negative 3 and x equals negative 5. Okay, so when solving a quadratic equation, factoring is always going to be your most efficient method. All right, so now let's consider another problem. All right, so what if we had the problem x squared plus 5x minus 12 equals 0. All right, so here our equation is already set equal to 0. All right, so if I go to factor the left-hand side, we have no GCF, so we're going to do try to by. So we would look for numbers that multiply to 12 and subtract to 5. All right, so we run into a problem here because if I look at the factors of 12, that's 1 and 12, 2 and 6, 3 and 4. So none of these pairs subtract to 5. So here we have a trinomial that can't be factored. Okay, so the quadratic formula can be used to solve a quadratic equation where factoring doesn't apply. All right, so before we get into the quadratic formula, we first have to review writing a quadratic in standard form. Okay, so standard form of a quadratic looks like this. It's ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Okay, so a is the coefficient, or the number in front of x squared. B is the coefficient, or the number in front of x, and c is the constant at the end. All right, so in these examples, we want to rewrite each quadratic in standard form and then state the values of a, b, and c. Okay, so in this first example, I'm going to subtract 12x on both sides. Okay, so we get x squared minus 12x equals negative 20. And then I'm going to add 20 to both sides. Okay, so that's my quadratic in standard form. So in this case, a, the number in front of x squared, is 1. B, the number in front of x, is negative 12. And c is 20. All right. If we look at the next example, to get this in standard form, all we have to do is subtract 18. So we get 2x squared plus 9x minus 18 is equal to 0. So here A is 2, B is 9, and C is negative 18. Okay, so now let's look at the quadratic formula. Okay, so again, a quadratic formula can be used to solve any quadratic equation. All right, so the quadratic formula is the following. X equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. All right, so I know it looks a little intimidating, but it's not that bad. So let's go back to our original example. X squared plus 5x minus 12 equals 0. Okay, so this quadratic is already in standard form, so I can write down my values of a, b, and c. So a is 1, b is 5, c is negative 12. Right? So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to write down my quadratic formula. So again, it's x equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. All right, and what's nice is that this formula is on your reference sheet. Okay, so it's not a formula that you have to memorize. Okay, so now I'm going to substitute my values. So x equals the opposite of b. So the opposite of 5 is negative 5, plus or minus the square root of 5 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 12 all over 2 times 1. All right, and notice when I substitute, I always put those numbers in parentheses. Okay, so now to simplify this. So to simplify this, we're going to use our calculator to help us. So I'm going to take this entire expression that's underneath the radical, and I'm going to stick it right in my calculator. Okay, so that expression was 5 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 12. Okay, so again, I'm putting in my calculator just as I have it on my paper. So that entire expression underneath the radical is 73. Okay. So now I'm going to come back to my paper. So we get x equals negative 5 plus or minus radical 73 all over 2. Okay, so remember, we said a quadratic always has 2 solutions. Okay, so that's where that plus or minus comes into play. Okay, so technically here we have 2 solutions. We have x equals negative 5 plus radical 73 over 2. And we have x equals negative 5 minus radical 73 over 2. All right, you don't actually have to write it as 2 separate answers, but you can if you want to. Okay, so on the next page, I did write down a procedure for you guys. Okay, so in step 1, you always want to rewrite the equation in standard form, determine the values for a, b, and c, substitute the values into the quadratic equation, and then simplify. Okay, so let's do one more example. So let's look at 2x squared minus x minus 14 equals 0. Okay, so again, it's already in standard form, so I can write down my values of a, b, and c. So a is 2, b is negative 1, and c is negative 14. Okay, so I write down my quadratic formula. x equals the opposite of b plus or minus b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Okay, so again, all we're going to do right now is substitute. So the opposite of b, so if b is negative 1, the opposite of that is just going to be positive 1. Plus or minus negative 1 squared minus 4 times 2 times negative 14 all over 2 times 2. Okay, so now to simplify this, we're again going to look at the expression underneath the radical. Okay, so we're going to type that whole thing right into our calculator. Okay, so we had parentheses, negative 1 squared. All right, make sure in your calculator you're using parentheses, minus 4 times 2 times negative 14. Okay, so that entire expression underneath the radical is 113. Okay, so if we come back here, we get x equals 1 plus or minus radical 113 divided by 2 times 2 in the denominator equals 4. All right, and 113 is a radical that we can't simplify any further, so we would stop here. Okay, so again, those are your two solutions. All right, so I hope this video was helpful as an introduction to the quadratic formula. We'll probably be putting up a worksheet for you guys to practice with an answer key provided. All right.